Can anybody? Oh, there it's on. Okay, great. All right. Waiting for the few people to come in. All right. So welcome everybody to the first of 4 public meetings on EPA's proposed plan for cleanup of the Portland Harbor Superfund site. And the purpose of these meetings is to provide an opportunity for the public to learn more about the proposed plan and also to provide more opportunities to give comment. And when you came in, you would have been given a sheet like this, and it explains the various ways in this meeting that you can provide comment, both written and orally. And also on the other side, it provides the times and dates and locations of the upcoming public meetings, and there's addresses where you can send written comment either by email or snail mail during the public comment period. And the public comment period has been extended. It now ends on September 6th. Of this year. So you have 90 days. So, and also I should point out that all comments are treated equally, whether they're given here orally or in writing, or whether you go home and send in a written comment. So you don't have to worry about maybe this comment being more important. So what we're going to do in this room is not provide comment, because there's other opportunities in the second and third floor to do that. But we're going to have a presentation that will provide more details on the proposed plan. And Christine Cook, the project manager for the site, is going to give that presentation. And after the presentation should last about 30 minutes. Afterwards, we'll have a question and answer session that should last 30 minutes or so, where we'll send the microphone around to anyone who has a clarifying question, and you can feel free to ask that question, and the EPA team will be up here and they'll do their best to answer that question. And then after the question and answer period, we will have an open house type of forum where people can engage with the EPA staff one-on-one and ask more detailed questions if they need more information. So without further ado, let me introduce Christine Cook, and she will give her presentation.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay. So good afternoon. My name is Christine Cook. I'm one of the project managers for the Portland Harbor Superfund site. I've been working on this project since 2005. I'm very glad to be here in front of you today. We are going to be talking about a proposal for cleaning up the in-river portion of the site. This is an informational presentation about the proposed plan. Following the presentation, EPA will answer clarifying questions directly related to the informational presentation. Public comments on the proposed plan will not be taken during the presentation. Public comments will be taken in other areas of this building today. So the lower Willamette River has over 100 years of history of industrial use. Business practices were much worse in the past than they are now. In sediments, we're mostly dealing with the legacy of historical contamination of persistent organic pollutants that do not readily degrade. The river has many uses: habitat for fish and other wildlife, treaty fishing area for Native Americans, and recreation for residential neighborhoods. So it is important that we clean up this historical contamination. Since 2000, EPA has worked with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, 6 federally recognized tribes, 3 natural resource trustees, and the Lower Willamette Group, a group of 10 potentially responsible parties for the cleanup. We have done extensive studies of the amount of contamination in the Willamette, how people and the ecosystem could be harmed by the contamination, and options for cleaning up the contamination. We have sought public input throughout this process. This map up here shows the lower reach of the Willamette River. It is about 26 miles long. The confluence is at the Columbia. When we first listed the site, it was listed from river mile 3.5 to 9.2. As we progressed through the studies, the site has grown from river mile 1.9 to 11.8. Up above the site is called the downtown reach. That's river mile 11.9 to 15.3. This is an area where there are contamination and sources, and Oregon Department of Environmental Quality is working on cleaning up that reach of the river. Above that is what we call the upriver reach, and this is where we have collected background or reference data for the site, since it is an area that is not impacted by contamination from the site. So this cleanup proposal is one part of a three-part process. We have already started cleaning up some of the most contaminated areas within Portland Harbor. We call them early action areas. Some of the areas that have been cleaned up include Gasco, Terminal 4, and the state did an oversight cleanup of Arco BP. We also have a Superfund site within our site, which is McCormick and Baxter, and that has a final remedy. Source control is an important aspect of the cleanup to reduce risk and prevent recontamination. Oregon Department of Environmental Quality has been in charge of a comprehensive source control program. A plan that discusses the status of source control can be found on DEQ's website. I'm here to talk about the third part, cleanup of the contamination in the river. Cleanup of contaminated sediment in riverbanks, along with controlling sources of contamination, will indirectly address contamination in other media, such as surface water, pore water, and biota. A baseline human health and ecological risk assessment was conducted for the site. Based on the risk assessments, there is unacceptable risk to humans and the environment. Risks are both cancer and non-cancer. Non-cancer risks dominate the site, which is unusual for a Superfund site. PCBs and dioxin-furans pose the most risk. Infants who are breastfed from mothers who eat fish from Portland Harbor are most affected since they receive a higher dose relative to their size and are sensitive to the effects of PCBs. The goal of Superfund is to clean up contaminant concentrations to reduce risk to acceptable levels. This does not mean cleaning up all the contamination released into the environment. There are 64 contaminants of concern at this site. Some of the contaminants are unique to certain media. Media includes sediment in riverbanks, biota, surface water, and pore water or groundwater. While some of these contaminants, however, are found in all of the media. Not all of the contaminants are co-located. Some are found in one part of the site and others found in another part of the site. They were released from different sources, and where we see high concentrations of contamination in the sediment, we also find high concentrations in other media. So again, we're going to be talking about the 24 contaminants that are found in sediment and riverbanks. So it's difficult to develop and design cleanup options when you have 64 contaminants. So in order to simplify this approach, what we've done is determined some focus COCs that we can use that address all the contaminants. So we're still going to clean up all the contaminants, but in order to develop these cleanup options, we focused in on contaminants that had the largest footprint, addressed most of the risk, and were co-located with these other contaminants. So once the focus COCs were identified, we used what's called remedial action curves to determine where to dredge and cap in the river. This is an example of a remedial action curve. It is one of many tools that can be used to develop cleanup areas. A curve was created for each of the focus COCs. This is just one of them for PCBs. So the top of the curve up here shows the current level of contamination in the river. How the curve is created is by removing one sample at a time and replacing it with your PRG. And as you do that, it creates this curve. So when you look at what contamination do I need to get to, this shows where we start with B. And you can see that very little acres are associated with B, but you get a lot of concentration reduction just by going to that point. And as you move down, the area across here increases with each one, and the concentration in the site drops until you get to about this point, alternative E. So that's where we start to get more area involved with less drop in the concentration. And especially when you get out into this far end of the curve, you'll see you have to do a lot to get a very little difference in the concentration. And alternative H is on the line where the PRG intersects the remedial action curve. So again, this is an example of contaminant distribution in the site. So this one is for PCBs as well. This one shows that there are a lot of samples that are very low concentration, but there are definitely contaminant concentrations above that. We've binned these into different levels. These correspond with the RALs from the previous RAL curves. You can see how much is associated with each one.
Sorry, Christine.
That's okay. And this figure shows then how that translates into the map of where it's located in the site. So this shows the B RAL, which is in red, so you can see the red areas of the site. And C would include the red and the orange. So that footprint includes both, and as you go down, you keep including all the ones above it to see how big that footprint is. And then, of course, the H includes pretty much the entire site. There are a few areas where it is not located. So once we have where we're going to do some active cleanup, we then look at what are our technologies or our options for cleaning up the contaminated sediment. There are basically 4 types of technologies that work to address sediment contamination. The first one shown on this slide is physical removal or dredging of contaminated sediments. Once an area has been dredged, a layer of sand will be placed over that area to deal with any residual contamination that remains. Options to deal with dredged material after removal include treatment and disposal in either an on-site disposal facility or an off-site disposal facility. So what happens here is that you have a dredge, which is on a barge, and it has a clamshell that comes down, and the clamshell clamps shut over the contaminated sediment, and then it brings it up through the water column and puts it onto a barge. And then from the barge, it is taken to a transloading facility where it's then loaded onto trucks and transported to a landfill. Another option for cleanup is called containment or capping, and that's where we cover the contaminated sediment with clean material. This typically includes layers of sand, gravel, and rock designed to contain and isolate the contamination. Where this happens, these areas are then designated as a cap, and we have to maintain those caps as long as the contamination remains in the sediment. So that's pretty much beyond our lifetimes and into the future. This slide shows two very similar yet slightly different technologies. One is monitored natural recovery, which relies on the flow of sediment from upriver to cover or mix with contaminated sediments, and it includes long-term monitoring. We considered this technology for Portland Harbor because a large amount of cleaner sediment from the Willamette watershed deposits in the site. The other technology is enhanced natural recovery. With this one, we enhance natural recovery by putting a thin layer of sand over the contamination and then allow that sand to mix and dilute the sediment contamination in the river. In situ treatment was also used as either a component of capping or enhanced natural recovery, or in the residual management layers after dredging. So all the alternatives include varying combinations of all these technologies. Some of the things that we thought about in assigning technologies to a particular area include the type, amount, and depth of contamination, the likelihood that people, wildlife, or fish come into contact with the contamination, the potential for natural recovery or scour to occur, the likelihood that it might be disturbed by fish, ships, or construction activities, and the need to maintain water depths and habitats so that people and fish can continue to use the waterway. Institutional controls are also a part of all the alternatives. They are primarily used to protect humans from exposure to contamination, since birds, fish, and wildlife don't read signs or obey restricted areas. For the whole river, we would have a consumption fish advisory until we meet the cleanup goals. And in capped areas, we would have regulated navigation areas and land use restriction areas to ensure that those caps don't get disturbed and release the contamination back into the environment. So why are we including monitored natural recovery and not proposing to clean up the whole waterway? Mainly it's due to the implementability and costs associated with the contamination of such a large area. The site is 2,167 acres, which is a large area. It also has to do with a lot with what's coming into the site. Sediments transported into the site are cleaner than sediments within the site. This river is what's called a transitional river system. While 18% of the upriver sediment load is retained in the site, it doesn't stay there forever. All rivers are transport sediments, and the Willamette is no different. The majority of the river is depositional in some parts of the year and erosional at other times of the year. This results in mixing of cleaner upriver sediment with contaminated sediment and dilutes those concentrations in the surface sediment where the exposure occurs. But then this mixed layer gets transported downstream slowly. So these processes are occurring now, but the data shows that they are not occurring fast enough to let the river processes occur on their own. So some action needs to be taken. So we do have evidence of M&R. We have done bathymetric surveys, multiples of them. We looked at deposition rates based on the difference between these bathymetric surveys. We also looked at how consistent is the deposition and erosion based on those bathymetric surveys. We've looked at sediment grain size. Where we find fines, we know we have deposition, and where there's coarser material, we know it's more erosional. We look at anthropogenic factors, such as propeller wash, where we know that those activities that humans do will not allow monitored natural recovery to occur. We also looked at surface to subsurface concentration ratios. This allows us to see where we have more mixing occurring in the upper surface layer than in the subsurface layer. We also looked at where we have wind, wave, and wake actions, because in these nearshore areas, that constant sloshing of the water is going to continue to erode away any sediment that deposits in those areas. So based on these lines of evidence, EPA has concluded that M&R is a viable cleanup technology that can be used, but it can't be used in all areas of the site, especially with higher concentration areas. So this slide shows a summary of all the alternatives evaluated in the feasibility study. As you can see, with each alternative, the areas of dredging and capping, or just capping, increase as you move through the alternatives. But the areas of pure in-situ treatment, enhanced natural recovery, or monitored natural recovery decreases. Also, the time frame for construction increases and the cost increases. So the preferred alternative for EPA is Alternative I. It was developed from Alternative E and has been modified in some areas to reduce the construction impacts while maintaining consistent risk reduction. This is why Alternatives E and I perform very similarly in the evaluation of the alternatives. Balancing impacts of construction to community and environment with cost duration of construction were considerations in developing Alternative I. These are some of the areas that were modified from Alternative E to develop Alternative I. This is a map of where each technology is used in the river. This map was developed based on the Remedial investigation data set. The footprint shown here will be further refined in Remedial design. Also, this map is shown on this wall over here, so if anybody wants to go take a look at it after the presentation, you're welcome to. This figure also shows the breakdown of the different technologies used for the site. So this pie on the left shows the breakdown between monitored natural recovery and sediment management areas where we're going to be dredging and capping. This is the McCormick and Baxter cap, which is a final action, so we're not going to take any action in that area. And then this other piece, 3%, is enhanced monitored natural recovery. So what we have found is by taking action or capping and dredging in this 11% of the site translates into addressing 85% of the risk at the site. And so what we're going to do is allow 88% of the site through M&R and EM&R to deal with the last 15% of the risk. So EPA's regulations dictate the criteria we use. Any plan we choose must meet the first two criteria: protect human health and the environment, and comply with federal and state environmental laws. Then we use the 5 balancing criteria to weigh the relative pros and cons of the alternatives. The last 2 criteria are generally considered after the public comment period, but we considered these 2 in coming up with the preferred alternative using extensive feedback received to date. So alternatives have different features and effects. For example, alternatives with more natural recovery have lower cost, lower impacts to construction, but higher uncertainty because we're relying on what may happen in the future with monitored natural recovery. Alternatives with more dredging have higher cost and higher impacts due to construction and are more certain and permanent in the long term. This is just a snapshot of how the alternatives were evaluated in the feasibility study. We are proposing alternative I, which we believe meets the first two threshold criteria and achieves the best balance between the remaining 5 criteria, with an acceptable amount of uncertainty that will achieve our cleanup goals in a reasonable time frame. Some additional outcomes of the preferred alternative are provided on this slide. More information about the benefits and trade-offs of this alternative compared to other alternatives is discussed in more detail in the proposed plan. So please, we're here to hear what you think about this. We have many forums for you to provide your comments. All the documents that support this cleanup plan are found on EPA's website. You can comment through email by sending comments in the mail or using our electronic comment box on our website or orally at any of EPA's public meetings, but not in this room.
Thanks, Christine. And now we're going to start our question and answer session. And I'd like to invite the EPA team to come up. Here we go. And Julie is going to be manning the microphone, or personing the microphone. And if people have questions, if you could just raise your hand. And if anyone's in the overflow room, I don't know if anyone's watching from the overflow room, but you'd like to come in here and ask your question. So we'll start. Julie? And please be sure to talk into the microphone because otherwise it doesn't get recorded.
Could you tell us a little bit more about your successes in early cleanup?